Good afternoon, everybody. Eli Berry here again with another video about the nature and the role and the function and the impact of propaganda on modern life. Pardon me, just finished lunch. Anyway, before we continue talking about different cases of propaganda, I thought it would be a good idea to take another couple of moments to talk about some of the things that can result in propaganda working effectively. We've talked about the way that the woozle effect in closed informational spaces can promote and amplify propaganda, but now we need to take a couple of videos to take a look at emotional states or states of mind that can render people especially vulnerable to propaganda. Now remember, all propaganda effectively functions on an emotional level because emotion is very rapid, it's reactive, it doesn't think its way through a situation, it just tries to respond to the situation in the best possible way. And the emotions that respond the most rapidly and with the least amount of thinking are those that we associate with danger. These are emotions like fear, disgust, and anger. Again, this all goes back to our million-plus years evolution becoming what we now are today. Fear is a very powerful emotion that elicits a very quick response because fear is how you keep away from the lion that wants to eat you. Disgust is an equally powerful emotion which elicits an equally strong response, though not quite the same response itself, but it's equally powerful. Because disgust is what keeps our ancestors or us in a survival situation away from things like bad meat, which could make us sick, feces, which could make us sick, certain kinds of animals, which are able to make us sick. So these are emotions that propaganda plays on all the time because they're easy to identify, easy to work with, and they have a fairly profound effect without a lot of work on the propagandist's part. But there's a somewhat more complex emotional state that we need to have a careful look at before we continue, and that's a state known as alienation. Now, most of you who know this term in reference to emotion or propaganda or anything else to do with humans probably know it through the works of Karl Marx. Now, I am not a Marxist, but Marx was very good at finding ways of describing situations that he observed around him. He was an acute observer of the reality as he observed it in his time in the early to mid 19th century. Now, the thing about alienation is that alienation is the emotional state that arises when a person is part of a group, but they don't feel like they are getting benefits from their membership in that group that are commensurate with the work they're putting into that group. Now, Marx posited that this is something that would primarily, or at least initially, occur in factory workers. Because part of the transition from sort of proto-capitalist, late feudalist economic organization like we saw in the Renaissance and into true capitalism was the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution meant that factories got larger, jobs got less and less complex, and the amount of work that a person could see themselves doing that went into a given product decreased. Now, that might have been tolerable except for the fact that after a certain point, economies of scale kick in. What this means for workers in Marx's hypothetical view of the world is that essentially the amount of work they put in that is meaningful for them decreases, while their wages do not increase. They're putting in work that they feel less and less and less emotionally invested in, and the take-home from that work is becoming less and less meaningful to them. They're part of a system, but the benefit they derive from their membership in that system is decreasing. They are beginning to pull away from investment in the system as a whole. And in order to show what this is like, I'd like to offer two examples from my own life. When I was in university, I worked at two different restaurants. One I worked at for about 3 months, and the other I worked at for a cumulative period of several years over 3 separate chunks of time. The first of these restaurants, I was a dishwasher, and the money was not great, but it was there. But the really important thing was that the boss was a jerk and everyone hated him. We saw him consistently breaking rules that we had posters around the back of the restaurant telling us were very serious and not to even think about them, things like drinking alcohol on the job. We saw him drinking alcohol and then driving home. We saw him never working behind the stove or behind the register, mostly just sitting around in the back shouting at us. We were alienated in that environment. Yes, we were making money, and that's better than making no money at all, but nobody felt any pride in what they were doing. Even the cook, who was one of the best cooks I've ever known in my life, felt absolutely no pride in his work because he wasn't allowed to innovate. He wasn't allowed to cook in ways that were interesting or that produced better results. He had to follow the owner's instructions, even if it produced a worse product. And like most craftsmen, cooks want to put out a good product. They take a lot of pride in taking their own two hands and turning raw material into something good. Talk to any craftsperson you like. Talk to somebody who knits sweaters. Talk to somebody who does woodworking in the garage on their days off. Especially talk to anybody who does handwork for a living. And what you'll discover is that an awful lot of the time, especially the really good ones, they're very intensely proud of what they do, partly because they are the ones doing it. But in that first restaurant that I worked at, total alienation. Nobody there was going to come in and work extra hours. Nobody there was going to put themselves on the line for that business. We did not feel that we were actually involved. We were cogs in a machine who could be replaced at will. I left that restaurant and went to work in a pizza restaurant that had just opened in my town. I actually harassed the owners every couple of days for about 3 weeks until they finally hired me, mostly just to shut me up and get me out of their hair. Because I could see from the first time I went in that the owners and the staff were invested in what they were doing. Now, I was a dishwasher there too, but the owners were there working with us. Maybe they weren't doing all the same jobs. Maybe they weren't in position all shift, every shift, but when shit hit the fan, the owners were there working. They were on the make tables. They were on the prep tables. They were doing whatever was needed. Also, the cooks, the dishwashers, everyone was encouraged to innovate, to find ways to make things work better. If a cook invented a new pizza that, the staff thought was really good, they'd try it out on a couple of the regular customers first, and if the regulars liked it, it went on the menu. A couple of guys even got pizzas named after themselves that way. I was just the dishwasher and the delivery guy. But I came up with a couple of ways of doing things that made the system work a lot smoother. And when I did that, I started getting tipped out by the waitresses. I got a raise from my bosses. I got very publicly attaboyed by the bosses and the head waitress. Anybody who did something like that in that little pizza shop, everybody knew that they had done something good. And when we had a good year, and everybody knew we had a good year because we were exhausted. We weren't closing until 12 or 1 a.m., man. We were just beat flat. But come the end of that fiscal year, there'd be a raise. Maybe not a big one, but there would be something that felt like it was roughly commensurate with the increase in the amount of business and the increase in our output of work. We were not alienated. Now, let's take this concept and stretch it out to the broader society. If people feel that they are part of a system, a society, in which they are doing a lot of work and for which they are getting very little, whether that's true or not, if their emotions are telling them that, they are going to be very vulnerable to anybody who comes along and offers them an explanation for why this is. This is part of the reason that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have been so popular and so powerful throughout world history. They provide a wonderful way for a propagandizing power to explain the difference between reality and truth. If the truth is that we are all part of this system together and everyone is deriving similar levels of benefit from their membership in it, but the reality is that it's Manchester in 1885 and the life expectancy is below 30 and the place is horribly polluted and little kids are losing their fingers in the cloth mills, there's a big gap between those two. In a situation like that, people are going to readily accept a conspiracy theory that offers a scapegoat to blame, someone outside their closed informational space, an outsider who is to blame for this disconnect. This is why it is so popular for propagandistic powers like monarchies or dictatorships or oligarchies to blame outsider minorities, right? And they all do that. They love that trick. But alienation is why it works. These are people who feel that the group they're in, the society they're in, is exploiting them in some way. And because they can see the difference between what they experience and what the leadership of that group is telling them, they do not have any level of emotional investment in that group or in maintaining the integrity of that group. In fact, they may wish to destroy it. And there's a really interesting parallel here between alienation and the rise of these conspiracy theories in the past, and even in the rise of things like communism and the rise of populist right figures like Donald Trump. About coming up on 10 years ago now, an article appeared on a website called cracked.com. The article was called "How Half the Country Lost Its Fucking Mind." And it purported to be an explanation for how Donald Trump could have become so popular with a Republican base that, at least on a surface level, should hate him and everything he stands for. It explored the question of why did this happen? And the author hit upon something very interesting. Essentially, Trump's base of support is not Republican or Democrat, obviously. It's not rich or poor. It's not black or white. It's rural. There has always been a divide between the city and the countryside. People in the cities tend to have materially better lives because they have greater access to resources. They tend to be better educated because they are physically closer to centers of education. They tend to have far greater levels of exposure to foreign people and foreign ideas. And they look down on the people in the country as a bunch of hicks. And the writings of all sorts of people across thousands of years support that this is a fairly constant thing in human societies. People in the cities look down on people in the country. People in the country, meanwhile, typically take a great deal of pride in the fact that they're the ones who supply raw materials. Without people in the country, people in the cities would starve. Without farmers, there's nothing to eat. Without miners, there's nothing to burn or to refine or turn into products. Without lumberjacks, there's no wood to be turned into furniture. And for a very long time, there was an intense level of pride associated with rural lifestyles. But over the last half of the 20th century, in the West, that has broken down, because those rural jobs have been increasingly taken over by automation and by large multinational corporations like Monsanto. And the thing about economies of scale that I mentioned earlier, they work at different levels for different levels of scale. An economy of scale that makes money for Monsanto will not make money for a family farm of 100 or 1,000 acres. And what this has meant is that, along with other things, rural people's jobs have been absolutely hollowed out over the last 50 years. Things like Monsanto, Walmart, These are taking people's jobs. They're taking away people's ability to feed themselves, to feed their families. Meanwhile, if they try to up stakes and go to the city, there are structural barriers in place that make that extremely difficult and extremely expensive. And on top of that, there's the fact that they know, because they can see it every day on television and hear it every day on the radio, that when they go to the city, if their accent or their manner of dress or their favorite food identifies them as being a person from the country, they're going to be in for a ration of shit. They're going to be treated with a great deal of disrespect and contempt, even if they are an educated person. And this is something that I have seen in unfortunate detail in response to Hurricane Helene. Saw it in response to Katrina, too. The cities are treated as important. Asheville is treated as important. New Orleans is treated as important. The people in the countryside are treated as collateral damage that really should have moved to a city years ago anyway. And if they didn't, then they're just too stupid to be allowed to continue breathing. The amount of snide, venomous sadism, and I use that word with consideration, that I saw after Katrina and that I have seen after Helene is insane. And I repeat, snide, venomous sadism. People speak about these country folks of the Gulf Coast or the Appalachian Mountains as if the only worthwhile thing they can do is die. And then they wonder why those people don't believe the stories coming out of the cities. They wonder why those people don't believe that people in the cities consider them worthy of assistance. They wonder why those people think that no assistance is coming, because those people see in social media and on national media that a lot of the people in the cities, if they had a choice, really would just leave them to starve and laugh at them the whole time. This is something that produces intense feelings of alienation. Rural people are a minority in the United States and I believe in most of the developed world. The developed world runs on the economic activity of cities, and increasingly it runs on the raw resource productivity of heavily automated multinational corporations, bastards like Walmart or Monsanto. When people who live in those areas see their jobs disappearing, their quality of life going down, and other people basically telling them that they deserve it, that's going to alienate them. That's going to make them believe that those people who speak to them and speak of them with such unbridled contempt are hostile, dangerous. Remember those emotions, those really easy ones that provoke a profound reaction very quickly? Danger is right at the top of the list of things that provoke those emotions. Rural people around the world have seen what happens when a bunch of urbanites with more money than sense turn up and buy up land. They ruin it. They've seen what happens when huge corporations headquartered in big cities, in maybe even other countries, turn up in their little town. Look at any small town that hosts a Walmart. Any Walmart within 30 minutes drive is going to be the end of the small town butcher, the small town clothing store, the small town auto parts store. If it's part of a chain, like if we're talking like O'Reilly's here, they might survive. But if it's mom and pop's auto shop, a year after Walmart comes into that market, mom and pop's auto shop is a dead duck. They all know this. The forces that they see as ruining their lives come to them from large cities. On the other hand, the people in large cities see the forces which ruin their lives coming from the rural population. They see the outsized voting power of rural populations, especially rural states, in regards to the Electoral College in the United States. They see the tremendous cultural power of religious groups that thrive in the countryside but generally do poorly in the cities. They see all these things and they think, how can those people complain? They're screwing us. It becomes mutual alienation because each group sees the other as being the beneficiaries of the system that they're in and sees themselves as getting screwed over. One thing to remember here, Henry Ford was one of history's greatest bastards. He was a Nazi, he was an anti-Semite, he was a colossal control freak, but he had a brilliant plan to keep the workers in his factories from becoming alienated. He priced his cars and he paid his workers such that a worker in the Ford factory could buy a Model T with the equivalent of 6 months' wages. $5 a day times 5 days a week times 4 weeks a month times 12 months a year equals $1,200. The Model T came off the assembly line priced at $600. Ford made sure that his workers did not come alienated, at least not to the same extent as others did, because his product, which was a life-changing product, bear in mind, his life-changing product was accessible, new to them. People were willing to tolerate an awful lot from old Hank because they were not fully alienated from the economics of the way that his factories worked. They could buy and use the Model T. Our modern society is increasingly polarized, partly because of these feelings of mutual alienation between regions, between urban versus rural, between different linguistic groups, even between people who speak with different accents. And propaganda uses that sense of alienation, especially if it can be coupled with senses of fear or disgust, or the idea that the other person holds the listener in contempt, to drive those divisions and to make our societies less nimble. All right, that's going to be it for today, folks. I'm going to continue with some interesting examples of this later on. I hope you all have a good day, and God, I hate that I have a catchphrase. Don't trust but verify. Just verify. See ya.